Chapter 12, Part 2 of History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Christian Church during the First 6 Centuries by S. Cheetham. Chapter 12, Discipline and Life of the Church. Part 2. When the world mingled with the Church, the question could scarcely fail sometimes to arise, can an organization be said to be the Church of Christ when not only many of its members, but some even of its priests, are leading lives which shew no trace of Christian holiness? Are the sacraments efficacious which are administered by impure hands? What amount of corruption in an existing church justifies those of its members who desire purity in forming a separate society? Can anything justify separation? These were the questions which underlay the wretched conflict in the African Church in the 4th and 5th centuries, though the controversy first arose on a special point, and that one which could not emerge except in an age of persecution. The schism referred to arose out of the last persecution, when they who delivered up the sacred books to the persecutors were stigmatized as "traitors." Mensurius, bishop of Carthage, is said to have given up heretical books to the agents of the government instead of those which they sought, an act which to the more rigorous appeared an unworthy evasion. But he and his archdeacon Cecilian had probably given deeper offense by opposing the extravagant honors given to confessors, and the belief in the efficacy of relics. When Mensurius died, Cecilian was somewhat hastily elected as his successor by the bishops of the Carthaginian province only, and at once consecrated by Felix, bishop of Aptunga. As the bishop of Carthage had primatial jurisdiction over Numidia also, the bishops of that province were naturally aggrieved that the election had taken place without them. In their anger they declared that the newly consecrated bishop was almost a traitor, and that his consecrator was no better. The offer of Cecilian, to be reconsecrated by Numidian bishops if anything had been done irregularly, was received by them with scorn and contumely. Passion was already too hot to listen to the words of truth and soberness. They chose as bishop a reader named Majorinus, and, on his death in 315, Donatus, who headed the schism with so much zeal and ability that it came to be known by his name. Everywhere but in Africa, Cecilian was recognized as the legitimate bishop of Carthage. In Africa, the party which had chosen Majorinus, soon after the battle of the Milvian Bridge had made Constantine master of Western Europe, applied to him to name Galician judges who might decide the question at issue between them and Cecilian. Constantine was very unwilling to interfere in the affairs of the Church, but nevertheless named Maternus of Cologne, Retizius of Autun, and Marinus of Arles to adjudicate. These three, with 15 Italian bishops, met at Rome under the presidency of the bishop of that city, and, finding that the charges were not proved, fully acquitted Cecilian. To the dissident bishops the proposal was made that, if they would return into the fold of the Church, each bishop should retain his office, and that in a city where there were 2 bishops, the senior should remain, while for the other a see should be provided elsewhere. When the synod broke up, both Cecilian and Donatus were for a time detained in Italy, while 2 of its members were deputed to carry the official tidings of its decision into Africa. The Donatists were in no way appeased, but complained that their charge against Felix of Aptunga, the consecrator of Cecilian, had not been heard. He was accordingly brought before the proconsul at Carthage, and the falsehood of the charge against him made abundantly clear by the evidence of the imperial officials who had been concerned in the persecution. Further, the whole matter was referred to a council at Arles, the first ever called by imperial authority, which decided again in favor of Cecilian and against his accusers. The proposal which had been made in the previous year by the synod at Rome to Donatist bishops who renounced their schism was renewed. On the point specially at issue, it was laid down that an ordination by a traditor was valid, if the person ordained was duly qualified. It was also enacted, no doubt with a view to the Donatists, that false accusers should incur the penalty of excommunication, and declared that baptism in the name of the Holy Trinity was valid, even when conferred by a heretic. In these decisions as to ordination and baptism the principle is of course affirmed, that the sacraments are effectual because of Christ's institution and promise, though they be ministered by evil men. The Donatists were still dissatisfied, and again appealed to the emperor, who now determined to hear the parties in person. He sat for this purpose at Milan, and after hearing the pleadings on both sides, acquitted Cecilian and declared the charges against him to be calumnies. Constantine, however, soon became aware that the Donatists, far from respecting his sentence, were more active and aggressive than ever under their vigorous head, Donatus "the Great," and was at last moved to take secular measures against them. He decreed that their churches should be taken from them, and their most distinguished bishops driven into exile. These measures roused the schismatics to fury, and probably first caused the formation of the bands of ruffians who were afterwards so notorious under the name of Circumcellions. They did not fail also to try to gain the ear of the emperor, to whom they wrote, that they would never hold communion with his blackguard of a bishop, and requested full freedom for their worship and the recall of the banished Donatists. In a few years the emperor seems to have become convinced that it was impossible to crush the sect by violence, and that it was worthwhile to try the effect of gentle treatment. He repealed, therefore, all the edicts against them, permitted the return of their bishops, and declared in a rescript to his vicegerent in Africa that these frantic people must be left to the judgment of God. He also exhorted the Catholics to patience, which was indeed much required, as the schismatics not only behaved in the most outrageous manner towards them generally, but even drove them out of their own churches. Of any further measures of Constantine with reference to the Donatists we know nothing, but we know that in his lifetime they so increased and multiplied in Africa that, at a synod which they held in the year 330, 270 bishops of their party were present. But outside Africa they found few adherents. We hear only of 2 Donatist congregations in Europe, one in Spain, the other in Rome. They seem to have been particularly anxious to establish themselves under the shadow of the Apostolic See, but here they were only able to hold a meeting on a hill outside the city, whence they were nicknamed Montenses, Campite, and Rupite. When Constans succeeded to that portion of the empire to which Africa belonged, and attempted to put down the Donatists, the Circumcellions burst out into new fury. Contemporary authorities describe them as gangs of fanatics, generally of the lowest class, who, misled by some of better condition, under pretense of extraordinary zeal, declined all honest labor and held a kind of communism. They begged or seized food, and led a vagabond life, haunting and plundering the farmers' barns and granaries, whence they derive the name by which they are best known. They called themselves agonistici, combatants for Christ. With the help of these sturdy marauders, the Donatist chiefs resisted the agents of the civil power, and not unfrequently seized the churches of the Catholics by main force. They often scoured the highways in great companies, treated those whom they met, especially priests of the Catholic party, with the greatest brutality, committed burglaries, and indulged in drunkenness and all kinds of violence. With all this they had a morbid longing for martyrdom. They interrupted the worship both of Christians and of pagans in the most outrageous manner, with the deliberate purpose of being killed by the incensed worshippers. Nay, it is even said that they bribed men to put them to death. Their war cry of Deo laudes was heard with terror. This state of lawlessness continued, with some intermission, up to and during the time when Augustine was bishop of Hippo. It is not to be supposed that all the Donatists, many of whom were undoubtedly men of pure life, looked with favour upon the conduct of these vagabonds. Far from it. About the year 345 some of the Donatist bishops besought the imperial general Taurinus to put them down by force of arms, and he did his best to comply. About the year 343 died Cecilian of Carthage, whose election to the bishopric had been the beginning of strife. As, however, a Catholic, Gratus, was chosen to succeed him, the Donatists continued in schism. Africa was at this time in a wretched and impoverished condition, and the Circumcellion bands had probably been swelled by the addition of many whose principal desire was at any rate to get food. Constans therefore in 348 sent 2 commissioners, Paulus and Macarius, to that country to relieve the distress and to attempt the restoration of peace. But Donatus and other leaders of this party roused a rebellion, which compelled the commissioners to assert their authority by force, and so to bring about a state of things of which the Donatists bitterly complained. Macarius caused several to be executed, and others to be driven into exile, among the latter the great Donatus himself.